am Eileen O'Connell, and I manage Special Collections Library for the City of Albuquerque. But it is a great pleasure to have you here to talk about Little Beaver Town. And Roland is a member of Historic Albuquerque Incorporated, which has just been such a huge help in providing us speakers, information, variety, support. He is also a retired civil engineer, and he is an extremely talented photographer. There is one book on the table with display material that is not about Little Beaver Town, but Roland has an absolutely beautiful photo of the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad in it. And so we are very privileged that he is sharing his enthusiasm, his interest, his eye for both a great photo and his ear for a great story with us to tell us about the saga of the brief but impactful life of Little Beaver Town. Thank you, Roland.
Thank you. So, what got me interested in Little Beaver Town? Well, the first thing was I watched an episode, or I watched the movie, A Christmas Story. And in the Christmas story, it's based upon this young man who wants to get a BB gun, but not just any BB gun, the Red Ryder BB gun. And so, after the movie was over, I was kind of curious, and I went to Wikipedia, who doesn't, and looked up Red Ryder BB gun. So I found out more about Red Ryder. Well, then I found out that Red Ryder was a creation of Fred Harmon. So who's Fred Harmon? I looked him up. Turns out he lived in the Southeast Heights. Not just anywhere in the Southeast Heights, but about 6 blocks from where I live. So now I have a connection. I have a connection to the Christmas story. I have a connection to the Red Ryder BB gun. And I was off and running. I just moved here to Albuquerque in 1979. So I'm a relative newbie here. Many of you have lived here all your lives. So I wasn't here in 61 through 63, but if I had been, I would have been the prime age to be at this theme park. And there's a lot of connections that Little Beaver has with a lot of other things, and here's just a short list right here. The one I think is the most fun is Mr. Ed. Remember the TV show Mr. Ed? Well, the gentleman who voiced Mr. Ed is Alan Lane, and he played Red Ryder in about 30 movies in the 40s. So, Little Beaver Town and Fred Harmon has had a major impact. So before I go any further, this is not the Little Beaver we're talking about. This is Beaver Cleaver. You may have watched him. And there's a long story, I won't go into it, but Red Ryder, Fred Harmon, who created Red Ryder, never owned Red Ryder. He kind of got cheated out of the ownership because the guy that was the promoter kind of liquored him up and had his lawyer write up a 51-49 contract. So Steve Schlesinger owned Red Ryder for the rest of his life. And I was at the museum in Pagosa Springs and read through many of the documents. It was a legal nightmare for poor Fred for many of the years of his life. So where was Little Beaver Town? Well, this is kind of a little map to show you where it is. The site still exists. No one redeveloped it, and I don't know that there was any reason why they didn't redevelop it, but the city recently purchased it, and they didn't know what they had purchased. They just had an undeveloped plot of land between basically I-40, or what is now 333, and the Terrace Arroyo. And they have many open space properties in the Terrace Arroyo, and they wanted to have access from public right-of-way to the Terrace Arroyo, so they purchased this property there. And here's a little bit zoomed in. You can see this area here has all been developed, but this area here is where Little Beaver Town was. Is there a reason why the picture is vibrating, or are we having an earthquake?
We are having the earthquake known as art construction.
Another reason for me to love it. Here is an aerial photo from the 1960s. And I think it's interesting that there is no tramway. Wantabo is there, but it looks like it's a dirt road. And you can see I-40, or what will soon become I-40, not quite developed as well through the canyon as it was later. But here's where Little Beaver Town was, and you can just make out some of the outlines of the buildings. So in 1960 was under construction. Who remembers Western Skies Hotel? And you know its claim to fame, right? JFK stayed there. I can never mention Western Skies that someone doesn't say, well, JFK stayed there. Poor thing was there for like 20 years, and that's the only thing it's known for. So here's Red Ryder. Why was he Red Ryder? Well, he had red hair. His horse, by the way, was called Thunder, a black horse. You can see his red hair. He very much always wore a kerchief, yellow most often than not, and had a red shirt too. And in the comic books, you'll notice that most often that's the way he's attired. So, Little Beaver, and this is the page from Crack-a-Jack Funnies, in which Red Ryder shows up for the very first time. And it wasn't his own comic, he was just one character in this series of characters in this funny thing called Crack-a-Jack Funnies. And by the way, a gentleman named John Saunders, who's related to Dave Saunders, who played Red Ryder at Little Beaver Town, is in the back here laying out some materials. So after I'm done working or doing my presentation, please go back and see what he's brought. He has a number of comics. One of them is this Crack-a-Jack comic. So Red Ryder was orphaned, and here is unfortunately his father dying from being bucked off of a horse. And so Red Ryder adopts him, you know, and by the way, this is adopt in the Old West, where he just agrees to let him stay with him for the rest of his life. There's no papers. So here it is. This is the Red Ryder BB started it all. So Red Ryder was a major force from around 1940 to just in the early 50s, or maybe up in the mid-50s. It was in comic strips, comic books, rodeos, coloring books, radio programs, novels. Today, in Pagosa Springs, there's still a Red Ryder rodeo. And in Dulce, this is the 59th year of them having the Little Beaver Town event, which just happened in July. And by the way, Little Beaver Town officially opened July 15th, Saturday, July 15th, 1961. So we just passed the 56th anniversary, 66th anniversary. And I didn't know this, but JCPenney stores used to have a whole section in their clothing called the Outpost, where young men could be outfitted in Western clothing. And I don't have any pictures of that, but I would love to see an interior picture of a JCPenney with the Outpost sign. So here's, as I say, what all started it for me. This is the movie poster for A Christmas Story. And you can't really read this in this light, but it says, Ralphie wants an official Red Ryder carbine action 200-shot range model air rifle with a compass in the stock and a sundial. And he, pretty much every time the rifle is referred to, they go through that whole statement. The writer of this movie, actually this is kind of an autobiographical story. He wanted that gun too. So we're going to talk about Fred Harmon. This is a picture of Fred Harmon in the 20s. He was born in St. Louis, Missouri, but his parents moved to Pagosa Springs when he was less than a year old. And so he grew up basically on a very rough farm, and this was his life. So he was a true cowboy. By the way, he had red hair, and he had a black horse, which was coincidentally named Thunder. So here's a picture of Fred Harmon sitting at an artist's desk, and he first started out by drawing a character called Roland Penttila. Well, Roland Penttila was the beginning of Red Ryder, but it wasn't quite developed. What Steve Schlesinger, his promoter, helped him with is making it more interesting. So they came up with the little Beaver character, they came up with his aunt, who was kind of a crusty aunt, and so he kind of had more characters than just this Roland Penttila. Fred Harmon worked for a newspaper, and he worked alongside of a gentleman you may have heard of before, Walt Disney. And the two of them decided to go into business. So Fred Harmon and Walt Disney were in business for less than a year. It didn't work out. Walt Disney said, forget this, I'm going to California. And as they say, the rest is history. So why was he in Albuquerque? When he started writing his comic strips, back in that day, there was no internet, no way to transfer something digitally, and so he would draw up these cartoon strips, almost very larger than what you'd see them in the newspaper. And those were, I think, called proofs. And he had to get those to New York, where they were then published out to all the other newspapers that had that comic strip, or the syndication. And so he needed access to an aircraft that were going to New York pretty much daily. And Pagosa Springs Airport was snowed in for 4 to 6 months of the year, and so he moved to Albuquerque during the winter and had access to the Sun Bowl. So this is a picture of Fred Harmon. Fred Harmon appeared in many rodeos. I mean, there was no invitation he didn't accept. It was kind of a part of promoting the Red Ryder comic strip and comic books. And he always went with a little Beaver. And this particular little Beaver was played by Sammy Trujillo. The one that was here in Albuquerque was Troy Vincente. And the problem with being a kid and being in a theme park is it opened at 9 and closed at 8. And so you can imagine being 11 years old and having to put in those kind of hours. It was tough. And even though the park was open in the summer during when no school was happening, because he lived in Dulce, it was just too much for one person. So Sammy Trujillo and some of the other kids that he knew would alternate being Little Beaver at the park. And let's see if I can get this to work. How do I get a cursor? Oh, okay. This is a little introduction to the museum in Pagosa Springs.
If you're ever around Pagosa, there's a place you gotta see. It's out on the road to Durango, kind of a shrine to Western history. You see, there was this fella named Fred Harmon. His family helped settle this land. But growing up, young Fred wasn't just your typical ranch hand. Oh, he could ride with the best of them. But when his hands weren't filled with rope and ring, he'd pick up a pencil or some charcoal or a brush and draw you a picture of how the West was tamed. If you wanted more Western lore, well, you didn't have far to look. Just pick up your daily paper or a Red Ryder comic book. Yeah, that was Fred's work too. A nationally syndicated cartoonist. I don't think there was anything he wouldn't do to preserve the history of the West and pass it on for folks like me and you.
So I encourage all of you to visit the Fred Harmon Museum and Gallery in Pagosa Springs if you go through the state, Southern Colorado. It's a beautiful area. I love Pagosa Springs. I would go there in the summer, unless you're a skier. So here's the front cover of that Cracker Jack Funnies. It was only 10 cents then. I don't think you can get one today for 10 cents. So this was 1939. And in 1941, Dell Comics took it over, and that title ran for 151 issues until 1957. And has the distinction of being one of the longest continuous newsstand runs of any Western comic today. So this was a big deal. And this is the comic strip. This is the one that appeared in the daily papers. And this is how they would look. So 750 newspapers in the 1950s, and readership estimated to be 40 million.
Well, on that last slide, down at the bottom of the cover, it said something about Tom Mix. Was he involved in the comic book in some way?
Where is this?
Down in the lower
Oh.
corner?
Remember, this is Cracker Jack Funnies. So this was the first time Red Ryder appeared in any comic book. But it was not only Red Ryder. This is beginning now, Red Ryder. But these guys were also in that comic book. And so that's the only connection. This is called a paint book. Well, a coloring book, basically, what you and I would call it. And I checked recently, this is worth $120 to $185 if you can find one for sale. And this Red Ryder #1 from August of 1941 is worth around $1,000. John, did you bring one?
No, you told me not to bring really.
I told him, he's got one, I've seen it, and I was afraid to touch it. It's like the Holy Grail. So does anybody know who that is?
It says down there.
Oh, that's right, I typed it in there. She just happened to be on the cover of Collier's. Collier's featured an article about Red Ryder, and this was a promotional cutout of that article that Stephen Schlesinger had copied and then mailed out to a bunch of people. And I found this at the museum. This is a DVD. So they appeared in more than 35 movies. So that's quite a phenomenon, I think. Now this one was a black and white movie serial. I think it was the only serial that was done. And Don Barry played Red Ryder, and he took on the nickname Red for the rest of his acting career, even though this was the only time he played Red Ryder. And I bought that, so it's still available. And to say that it's corny would be missing. So here's Alan Lane, the voice of Mr. Ed. He was in these movies. Wild Bill Elliott was in these. And the last one to play Red Ryder was Jim Bannon. So there's been some famous Little Beavers too.
Were they shorts or were they full-length?
They were full-length movies, full-length Western movies. So yeah, the bad boy Robert Blake was Little Beaver. So Howard Hall and his buddy Ernest Sudrin, they were Albuquerque residents, and both of them worked for Standard Oil. I would call them executives, and they had worked for Standard Oil for a career, and ready for something else or ready to retire. And Howard Hall decided that he wanted to build this thing. So his concept of the name for this was the First American Indian Land. And back then they didn't care too much for acronyms, but you know, we're all about acronyms now, so consider the acronym for First American Indian Land. Perhaps it was doomed from the beginning. So he arranged for the sale of stock, and a gentleman named C. Morgan Carter, who was a real estate agent, set themselves up. They were going to receive a salary. And you can see as the months went on, the salary was increasing tremendously, so they had high hopes for this venture. Now this is a picture of Knott's Berry Farm in California, what's called the ghost town. Now I grew up in Southern California, and I was at Knott's Berry Farm all the time, because from the time I was 7 to maybe 11 or 12, this was the place to be. Mom, Dad, can we go to Knott's Berry Farm? And it was only a couple of miles from where we lived, so we went there a lot. I remember vividly Knott's Berry Farm. Well, obviously they did very well, but that's kind of the concept that I think that Ernest Sudrin and Howard Hall were after. So this is an Albuquerque Journal from February 28, 1960, and it talks about them getting ready to build this thing. And here are the list of attractions. Not all of them happened. The replica of Lost Mines was never built, and they didn't have a petting zoo, and the open stadium didn't quite, they had Indian dances, but it was a concrete slab with a bench around the edge of it, not really what I call a stadium. But they were going to build a 500-person restaurant, a sit-down restaurant. So again, they had high hopes. So here, according to the paper, these were the officers and directors. You see anybody up there you've you've met or heard of. It's kind of a wide range of people, from a Valley High teacher to a service station owner, Republican Party organizer, pretty much a wide range of groups. And other than this, I've never heard of Bill Ehret, and never visited the Longmore Rancher Museum in Moriarty. So they made a prospectus, and a copy of this prospectus is at the Center for Southwest Research at UNM, and it's 10, 12 pages, double-sided, filled with artwork like you see here. And here are some pages from it illustrating what it was going to look like. And you should probably read this because, again, talk about optimism and flowery language. I know they didn't have the internet then, but they must have had a thesaurus, because they got all the Greek adjectives in there. Dauntless, plied, well that's a verb, sorry, insurmountable. It's going to be a magic tour. Beatles picked that up a little bit later and made it a magic mystery tour. So, there was a groundbreaking. Of course, you have to have groundbreaking because that's another opportunity for publicity. And that happened on May 7th. And the New Mexico governor showed up. And there he is, the governor on the left and Ernest Sidran on the right, sharing the shovel. That's the groundbreaking. So this is a big deal. And why is it a big deal? Same thing, you know, when Facebook came to New Mexico. I mean, the governor went for the groundbreaking of the Facebook facility down by Milan because it's economic opportunities. So June 1st, here's some changes to the prospectus. And in just a few months, here's all these changes. Look at all the gones. Gone, 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 gone. So things are not happy in the land of First American Indian land. Alan Klein here, by the way, I found out through some research helped by members of the Historic Albuquerque Incorporated that he ran a tow truck company. Basically, you call him up when your car was dead and he towed it. So here it is, the prospectus and what they're gonna, how many shares they're gonna have. They could only sell to residents of the state of New Mexico. And they got in trouble a little bit later because somebody's relative said, hey, you should buy some of these shares, and they lived out of state, and the Securities and Exchange Commission found out about that and rained hellfire and brimstone on them for selling it outside of New Mexico.
Roland, what was the purpose of only having New Mexicans?
I don't know that there was a purpose. It was probably required by the then New Mexico Business or Corporations Code.
Okay.
I'm sure they would like to sell stocks to anybody.
It's federal law on stocks and bonds and securities that they have to be local otherwise they have to comply with the federal laws.
Oh, they'd have to be incorporated federally, so if they were only incorporated in Mexico, they could only sell. Okay, good. So here's the shares. They have 24,000 shares outstanding. They sold them at $3 a share. So just roughly 24,000 times $3 is $75,000. This thing was millions of dollars. The cost to construct this was millions of dollars. So I'm not sure. That's a stock certificate. I got in contact with Alan Carlson, and he said, I have a stock certificate purchased for me when I was 11 by my parents. You know, it was going to be his, it was going to make him a rich man when he grew up. So again, this is 1961 in April. They haven't opened yet. Fred Harmon is, quotes, affiliated with them. And instead of calling it First American Indian Land, I should have pointed out on the prospectus, they had a sign out front that actually had First American Indian Land. But between that prospectus and 61, in April 61, they had decided to call it Little Beaver Town. And you might ask why. I did. And they were trying to attract young people. You know, because the parents had the money, but the kids were going to be the ones pestering to come to Little Beaver Town. And they wanted to kind of incorporate the idea of kids were going to want to ask their parents to go. And by the way, Little Beaver is one of the first instances of a young sidekick to a hero figure. You can think of Batman and Robin, and there's others, where kids are part of that. And I think that's also marketing for the people selling Batman comics, because they want a young person involved in the process to kind of make a connection to who their comic book buyers are going to be. So this also announced that Dave Saunders will be Red Ryder, and Troy Vicente, who's an Apache from Bell State, was going to be the Little Beaver. So how did Fred Harmon pick Dave Saunders? Well, Fred Harmon lived in the Southeast Heights on Morningside Drive, and Dave Saunders and a couple of his friends were coming home from school, and they knew that someone famous lived in that house. And so they dared him, maybe double dog dared him, to go knock on that door, and Dave did it. He walked up to the door and knocked on it, and who should answer but Fred Harmon? And so I'm sure his friends ran away thinking, oh my gosh, you know. Fred talked to him for a while, invited him in, and the two of them became friends. They had similar histories. Remember, Fred was raised on a farm. Dave Saunders was raised on a farm. He was a real cowboy. And so they had a lot to talk about. They had a lot in common. And by the way, I mentioned earlier, Dave's son, John, is in the audience right here in the back. So stock sales were advertised in the Journal all over the place. And you notice that it's called Little Beaver Town up here, but it's also the First American Indian Land Incorporated. And interestingly enough, that address, 309 Washington Southeast, is right south of Central, and I drive by it every day. Of course, the office is not there anymore, but the building is. And so a little bit of Little Beaver Town still exists right here in the neighborhood. So these are pictures that were given to me by Bill Lasker. Bill Lasker worked at Sandia. He was the photographer for the Lab News, and also a stringer locally that did a lot of photography for the newspapers. If you Google, or not Google, but if you have a newspaper clipping service and type in Bill Lasker, you'll get hundreds of hits, because his photo credits are in many newspaper articles here in Albuquerque. But he was going to be one of the operators of Little Beaver Town. This building here on the edge was going to be his studio. And so he took pictures of it as it was going up. They made two large teepee structures out of substantial wood and then covered them with plaster. And the plaster was then painted with some generic Indian designs. And if you go out to that site, I led a walk there in July 9th, with the open space rangers, and you can still see some of the chunks of plaster that were on these large teepees. So this is a picture of Troy Vincenti standing out in front of it, of those teepees under construction. And so here's an aerial shot of the Little Beaver town going up. The idea behind it was that there was going to be like an old town here, and then there was going to be an Indian village over on the other side, because they were trying to carry both cultures, the Old West, and I've got to say, the theme for this was what TV and movies thought of the Old West, not necessarily what New Mexico was. And so I think that was one of its failures, was that we have here in the state a lot of authentic Old West, and this was kind of fakey Old West. Some people have, in my correspondence, some people thought that this was a movie set because they kind of knew of it and they just thought it was a movie set, and that kind of defined what it was. It was really a theme park, and no movies were filmed there that I'm aware of, but it was kind of the movie version of the Old West. So one of the things they did was they bought it's called an 1865 train, but really what it is a gasoline-powered kind of a miniature train. And they've got it set up so that some water falls on the hot elements of the engine and causes steam, which comes out of the stack. So it was made by the Allen Herschel Company. Allen Herschel Company in New York makes all sorts of carnival rides, and this was just one of them. Now, in the paper it says they spent $25,000 for it. I think, well, I did an inflation calculator for what $25,000 in 1961 would be today, and it's around $250,000. So this was a big expense, and that was just for the train and the cars, and it didn't cover the cost of building a track around it or anything else. So they really made a huge investment. Oh, there it is, $205,700. in terms of the value of the money. And there's a picture of it. Now, I did some research. I know how many of these trains were built. 41. And of the 41, all but 6 of them have been located by collectors. And I was in contact with the collectors and they say, we don't know where this one went. So it's another mystery. Where did this train go? So here you go, Tenderfeet. I used to watch a TV show called Tenderfoot. Anybody remember that? The newspaper's getting into the swing of things, calling you and I Tenderfeet when we go there. So on July 14th, the day before the opening, here it is, an advertisement. Now, Little Beaver and Red Ryder were compatible friends. There was, Little Beaver got Red Ryder out of scrapes all the time. And he was really a partner to Red Ryder in his crime-fighting activities. Kind of like Tonto and the Lone Ranger. But many Native Americans don't care for the characterization of Tonto. They see him as a secondary character, whereas they appreciate Little Beaver because he really was the heart and soul of the Little Beaver Red Ryder combination. But Little Beaver did in the comics speak in what we would call today pidgin English, and "you betch'em" was one of his big phrases. Today we would consider this speech to be demeaning, but then it was considered kitschy. So here's a promotional photo by Bill Lasker before it opens. This is Fred Harmon. This is Monty Montana. Anybody remember him? Monty Montana was a trick rider and a roper, and he was in a couple of movies and maybe a number of them. And he also, later in his life, when his movie career was kind of waning, he would go to rodeos and do rope tricks. I think I've got a picture in here later where one of his things where he would stand up on the saddle of two horses and be able to rope around both of the horses. And then here's Troy Vincenti. Dave Saunders isn't in this one. So here was an invitation to the gala opening. This is Bill Lasker's, provided by his son George. And I have one of these from the museum. That was an actual admission ticket. And one of the other mysteries I have is that I don't know how much they charge for admission. And it's not printed on this, and it wasn't in the newspaper, and no one who was there remembers how much they charged. One other possible reason for why the park didn't succeed was that some people thought that the admission and parking prices were too high. I would love to know what they were. And I think back in the 60s, they were probably $1 person to get in. Well, this is the parking lot on opening day. So it looks pretty popular to me. Here's the sign. Unfortunately, that sign is long gone, and I don't know where that is either. All you find out the site is the two steel supports that are cut off at the ground level, but they are still there. And this picture is also by Bill Lasker, taken with a 4x5 negative, which if you're a photographer, that gives you a really high resolution. I've zoomed in on this just to look at the old cars, because if you're a fan of old cars, there's a lot of interesting ones in this, but that 4x5 negative is a really great thing to look for. So this is Dave Saunders on the right, and Troy on the left. This is taken by local photographer Dick Kent. And the Kent family has been generous and allowed me to use their father's photographs in this presentation. So here are some pictures of opening day. And these headdresses with a feather and Little Beaver Town were given away on that opening day. And nobody I've talked to has one of those saved. I wish I could see or hold one of those. That would be very cool. And here's Monty Montana. One of his things was to rope people. I hope with their permission. So this is one of these buildings, and seeing the construction pictures, these buildings were not temporary. They were not thrown together. They're not mobile homes, then transferred here and given a false front. They did have false fronts because that was part of the artistic vision, but they were full-on buildings. I mean, with studs, 2x4 studs at 16 inches on center. So they were substantial buildings, and now they're gone, disappeared. I think also this is way east of town at that time, and this was set up to have all of the working functions. So they had to have city water, they had to have some sort of sewer, they had to have electricity, and all of that had to be brought out for the first time to that extent. It had to be extended from where they existed at that time. As a civil engineer, I can tell you that's not cheap. Fred Harmon actually had a gallery there, and when he was there on site, would actually sketch things for you. Here's Monty, Montana. I'm sure OSHA would not approve that today. This picture is Troy Vicente's cousin, Arnold Behill, who helped represent Little Beaver. Again, Dave Saunders in this picture. And, you know, that's a red shirt with a yellow kerchief. Dave was, in the pictures I see of him during this time, a very handsome man, you know, and fit the Red Ryder milieu very well. So these are some snapshots taken by various people of another view of that packed parking lot. And here's a little bit better picture of the Little Beaver Town sign that was along Route 66. And every day they had shootouts. So this was the bank, and so here's an unfortunate robber who has met his maker. I believe this is Dave Saunders going back into the bank. So the newspaper says that 5,000 attended Little Beaver Town. Here is a picture that Bill Lasker took inside of his photo studio of his friends at the gala opening. And I don't have the names of all these folks. This gentleman was one of the gunfighters. And I think this is one of the directors. I don't know if it's Howard Hall, but I think it might be Ernie Sudrin. This is George Lasker's mother, Bill Lasker's wife. And he's not in this picture because he's behind the camera. So this is a list of concessionaires at Little Beaver Town that was given to me by George. And it was his father Bill's typewritten list. So you might see some folks. Bob Johnson ran the Four Hills riding stables for a long time. I don't know, did any of you ride a horse over there in Four Hills? Do you remember Bob Johnson? No? So he kind of ran everything that had horses in it. So if it had a stagecoach or whatever. They actually had horse rides too. They would get the kids up on there. John Morgan ran a gun shop. Let's see. This is interesting. Bridger was the administrator of what was called the Osteopathic Hospital, which is now Carrie Tingley Hospital on University. He had won many state fair ribbons in wood carving. This guy is interesting too. George Shelton was an oil artist, and I've got a newspaper article in which he began experimenting with art made out of ketchup and mustard. So he would put ketchup and mustard in an artistic way onto some substrate, newspaper most often, and he put it in the oven and bake it. So there's an article in the paper about his art. I've never met anyone who has one of his pieces, so if you know anybody, please let me know. I want to know what mustard and ketchup looks like, especially 50 years later. So this is a shot taken from the hills to the north of I-40, Route 66. And it's funny, but what was the two-lane road over here was actually called at that time the Western Skies Frontage Road. And that's how you had to get to Little Beaver Town. So when you're on Route 66, which was a divided highway before it became a freeway, you had to know to get off at Tramway and then come back along the Western Skies Frontage Road. Another possible reason why it didn't do as well as possible, because there's no left turn bay here for someone coming into the city from Tierras Canyon to turn left into the park. You had to make that extra turn. Today, we don't think anything of it because we're used to freeways. So we're used to going past something and coming back on frontage roads. But In the 60s, it wasn't as common, and I think it confused people. So they had a Western Skies Motel. This building was actually named Western Skies Motel, but it wasn't a real motel. The best I can tell is that it had a lobby on the first floor, which sort of was looking like a hotel in the Old West might have looked like. And I understand they did have a service where if you were a traveler and you wanted a place to stay, they would call up the actual Western Skies and make a reservation for you so you knew you had a place to stay that night.
And the actual Western Skies was farther to the
Yeah,
west?
it was over here. Can't you see it? If you were a cat, you'd be over there. So Bill Lester had this Indian figure, and by the way, this is Bill. He was very short and had some problem with his spine. I don't know what the medical name is. But here's a gentleman who is what we would call disabled now, and he did many excellent things. He was an excellent photographer. He ran the studio during the 3 years that it was there. And when Little Beaver Town failed, he went back to his bosses at Sandia and said, "Hey, can I have my job back?" And they said, "Absolutely. We missed you." This is George, who's now, I think, in his 70s. And Vicki Lasker Langwell, I've talked with her. She gave me a lot of material when I was doing my research. She has this Indian in her living room now. And she's one of those people who decorates her house for every season. So I've now been to her house in Christmas, and it was an explosion of Santa Claus. And then I went to her house in Easter, and I was afraid I'd step on a bunny. And she's very into that stuff. But the Indian apparently meets all of the seasons requirements. So they had a saloon. One of the largest buildings on the site was called the Red Bull Saloon. And actually it survived. And many of you who've lived here and during your high school years may remember after 1963 when Little Beaver Town, Theme Town ended, the building called the Red Bull Saloon became Stage City, and they staged dances there and had live music. So I've heard from a number of people who either played there as a musician or who attended the dances. So no alcohol was served, by the way, unless you consider the beer that was in this root beer keg. Can-can dancers. Of course, you can't have the Old West without can-can dancers. So, and they were supervised by Kay Windsor. I don't know if you know about Kay Windsor. Kay Windsor had something like 9 or 10 dance studios around town in the 60s and maybe up through the 70s. So Phillips the Great attended performed there. I'm not sure about the Great because I've not heard of him in any other context than this. So who knows? He might have, been a stockbroker, and this is what he just did in his spare time. Another picture of the Red Bull Saloon. They had cowboy musicians. Here's a couple of the gunfighters with one of the can-can dancers, kind of putting on a little display here. We'll talk about this guy later. He has a role in Little Beaver Town history. So here's some pictures of the train. They actually had a trestle. The trestle is gone, but if you go out to the site today, you'll see a very large concrete support for the trestle on both sides. And here's a couple of shots of the stagecoach. They had a number of stagecoaches. They had 2 at least. one where it was lots of windows and one where it didn't have a lot of windows. And this stagecoach says Rocky Mountain Stage Lines. I think I know where that went. There was another Old West park out in the East Mountains that was called Sandia Frontierland. And I've seen photos from Sandia Frontierland, and they had the stage that says Rocky Mountain Stage Lines. And other than that, I don't know where any part of this went. I don't know where that elaborate bar went that was in the Red Bull Saloon. So here's people going on, or kids going on a horse ride. This place here was the Beaver Bugle newspaper, and you could go where it says any name on headlines. You could go inside there and you could tell them what headline you wanted, and they'd print up a copy of that. And I understand you have a copy to show us after my talk. The Indian dances were supervised by a gentleman named Ben Atencio. There were hoop dances. This is a hoop dance. And it turns out Troy Vincenti is a championship hoop dancer. So he wasn't just a pretty face, so to speak, as Little Beaver, but he would perform a hoop dance while he was there as Little Beaver. And here was that slab, and this is one thing that you can see if you go out to that site. That slab is still there. And you know, those are the mountains to the north across. This is I-40 here, so this is looking to the north. This is a home movie of some of the shootouts. Oops, I think I went backwards. There's no sound with this. Remember when we thought home movies were so cool?
You can see that on YouTube, by the way.
Yes, I saw it there, and I contacted Randy Wright, who uploaded it, and he gave me permission to show it. Everyone's heard of high definition. Well, this is super low definition. Now, this is Dave Saunders, and he's being helped by Little Beaver. And the gentleman lying on the ground who gets shot 5 times a day is Waco Williams. Waco Williams is his stage name. His name is actually Ken Lemke. Oop, got back up, got down. Here were little car rides. And this may have been the short time when Cliff Hammond brought rides over to Little Beavertown. He was kicked out of his property on Lomas because the surrounding residents didn't like the noise, and he needed to find another place to run his amusement park very quickly, and he went out to Little Beavertown for one summer. So Cliff Hammond was associated with Little Beavertown.
And that's Uncle Cliff.
Yeah, that's Uncle Cliff.
Where on Central?
No, he was on Lomas, and about the 7,000 block, there's a Valero gas station there right now. It's across from the Nissan dealership. I think we get another gunfight here. Waco Williams Now, in this case, I don't think he's robbed the bank because he seems pretty casual. There's Dave Saunders in his red shirt. Uh-oh. Taking him off to the sheriff's office. Kicking his cohort who led to his downfall. Look at that car. Oh my God. And that is the end. So here's Waco Williams. He identified himself as the fastest gun in the West because he would attend these shooting competitions. And he won very many of them. So he really could draw quickly and hit a target. And so he called himself the fastest gun in the West. However, I think he's most famous for being shot. Certainly at Little Beaver Town he was, but as a TV character, he is the gentleman who was shot by Matt Dillon at the beginning of every Gunsmoke ever. So when you watch Gunsmoke again, you see Matt Dillon walking out to the main street, and he draws and shoots the guy at the end of the street. That's Ken Lemke, dying again. He had more than 9 lives. Here's some more views taken by Alan Carlson as a kid, and that's Alan. He was 11 in '61, so born in '50, and he's younger than I am. Lots of people are younger than I am now. Ken Lemke didn't appreciate getting shot all the time, and I think he took out his anger on poor Dave Saunders, who got to be the hero all the time. And there's a story, and I haven't been able to verify this, there's a story that once when Ken was shot and Dave came over to stand over him victoriously, Waco Williams pulls out a Derringer and threatens to shoot him or fires, and it had live ammunition. And here's some snapshots from Ricky Harmon. Lasker made postcards, and here are 4 of them, and they were sold at his studio. And they form one of the best views that we have of what Little Beaver Town looked. They were in color, and they were very well done, and very well composed and printed. This is a poor representation of them, and we've got too many lights in here to see the real true colors. Here's Phillips the Great. And this is cool. Now, leave the children in Little Beaver Town while you visit the fair. You would be arrested today. And I don't have any statistics of how many kids got left at Little Beaver Town during the fair, even in the 60s, but at least they were advocating it. So here's the Clifford Hammond. This Mad Mouse, I think he brought that there. And then there's a helicopter ride. Those were Cliff's. You can see the helicopter in this view also. All of these rides, the train, the Mad Mouse, and the helicopter, all by that company in New York, the Allen Herschel Company. So poor Cliff. Cliff's really made a positive impact on this city and lived to the age of 97. But this Cliff's Amusement timeline was from his obituary, and so it lists his Little Beaver Town adventure. So here we are in 1961, July. The park's only been open for 2 weeks, and they're going to have a Western wedding. So Wayne Seeger and Jenny Gallegos are going to be united in holy matrimony by Mr. Lester H. Kohlberg. And here's the wedding. Now, this is the gentleman I pointed out before that we're going to see later. This is Wayne Seeger. This is Ken Lemke. This is Little Beaver. And, you know, of course, they rode in style to the ceremony, which was right in Main Street, right on a platform right in the Main Street. And they rode in the stagecoach. And here they are at the reception. This is Waco Williams. I don't know why he's not looking very happy. He's not going to get shot that night, so got to be a good night. There's Jenny Gallegos, Wayne Seeger, Dave Saunders, Fred Harmon, and his wife Lola Harmon. So it's May of '61. I'm jumping back a little bit in time, and they're talking about the officers that are elected. Ann Picard, who was a real estate broker, was elected president on May, and in August, she quits, and Howard Hull becomes the president. So again, they're having some problems. She only lasted 3 months. By the way, how many of you know Betty Sabo? Well, Howard Hull was her uncle. So people are selling stock. I don't know if they're panicking or because this is privately owned, which means get me out of this. And here's one. Let's see, 400 shares for sale at $1.50, half of the price they paid for. So here's a resolution in October. The park really operated during the 3 months of the summer. And that was another thing I think that led to its downfall. It cost somewhere between $2 and $3 million to build Little Beaver Town. And they were only going to be open for 3 months each year. So how do you run a business when you only have revenue for 3 out of the 12 months? But by October of the year they opened, they owe money to rent. And they only have $100 in assets, and they're at $235,000 in debt. So Fred and Lola Harmon take out a $47,000 mortgage on their house in the Southeast Heights to try and keep this thing afloat. And again, this is 1962. People are asking, is it really going to open? And they said, yeah, we're going to open on May 15th, but then they don't. So the landowner, which was a corporation called Research Park, gets a court decision against the First American Indian Land because they had not paid their monthly rent. Just more problems. So July of '62, Harmon becomes the leaseholder. And he's going to open the 1st of August in '62. So having problems. By the way, this is a cute little sidebar. Martin Chavez, as a little boy, ran and got the fire department to save his brother because there's a rock outcropping behind the Little Beaver Town, and his brother climbed halfway up and couldn't get back down. So Marty Chavez ran back to the house, called the fire department, and they drove over and rescued his brother. And this is the newspaper during the days when they gave your address. So, and I worked for the city, and I knew that Marty's mother lived in the south, in the Fort Hills area, but I never knew what her address was until I saw this. So here's the stagecoach in the State Fair Parade in 1962. This is Fred Harmon. This is George Lasker, Bill's son, who loaned me that stuff. I think this is Bob Johnson, but I can't confirm that because I haven't seen any other pictures of him with his name. So here the band and the Can-Can girls went down the Central on the State Fair Parade. And by the way, they won a trophy. Here's another journal ad from September of '62 offering free admission. So they're kind of getting desperate. They want to get people over there just to see what it looks like. And here's in April of '63, they hire a new manager, Philip Riblet, who is retiring as a major from the Air Force. And Diane Scheller from HAI, Historic Albuquerque Incorporated, helped me do a lot of research on newspaper clippings. And we found, or she found, a lot of Major Riblet articles, but none regarding his association with Little Beavertown. So I don't think that lasted very long either. So here's 1963, they're going to open May 1st. This is the only thing I could find that even confirmed that they operated in 1963. So if they didn't have enough problems. One of the young men who was part of the shootout crew gets fake shot and falls, and his gun discharges a blank into his leg and burns him. So later, his parents sued Little Beavertown and won 12 weeks of temporary disability at $20.40 per week, plus almost $500 in medical bills. Doesn't that sound like numbers we'd like today? So Little Beavertown's pretty much done by fall of 1963. I don't have any evidence that it operated after the fall of 1963. And Fred Harmon drew this cartoon, and it went in the Durango Herald, which basically says, "I'm done with Red Ryder." So when Little Beavertown died, Red Ryder died with him. So for a while, there were newspaper articles talking about charitable events being held at what was called the Palace, but was really the Red Bull Saloon, and then the Sage City. Many people remember the area as a place where teens would go and drink. And I've been told that there were a lot of vagrancies, maybe people living in these buildings that were abandoned. Like I say, they were built to last, which means you couldn't just lift them up and put them on a trailer and take them somewhere else. I mean, they were built to stay there. And I've been told that there were fires, and that's where some of the buildings went. They just burned. However, the lawyers for the city, there's a lawyer in the audience. Lawyers for the city, I guess, to protect the city from liability, told the fire department to destroy all fire records older than 5 years. So there are no records of them going out there to fight a fire at Little Beavertown. I would love to have any records of that. So the following are some pictures that were taken by Dick Kent. Another one, Bill Lasker is one of my favorite photographers. In the audience here, Dick Ruddy is one of my favorite photographers, and Dick Kent. So this is Little Beavertown in October of 1963. So we know it operated in '63, but there is no evidence of any humans anywhere in here. Now this is looking to the west, and you can see there's Western Skies Motel in October of 1963. It's now gone. I think it's a grocery store complex now. Here's Route 66. This is the Red Bull Saloon. This is one of those concrete teepees on one side. Then there was a adobe wall that ran down here, and this is the other teepee. This was a kind of a fence, a wood fence that separated the parking lot from the rail, and you can see the train is parked there, and the track went here, over the trestle, around here, down outside of the picture, and then up here, and then back again. So this is the Indian dance area. This was kind of Pueblo-style buildings, and Fred Harmon had his studio in one of these. This was the general store. This was Bill Lasker's photo studio. This was a wood shop. The sheriff's office and the bank. Well, that's the bank right there. The sheriff's office were over here. These were, I think, administration buildings, because I can find no theme park function for these. But I think they were offices, basically, to run the park. And the stagecoach is parked here. And again, Dick Kent took very high quality, large negative pictures. So you can zoom in on these and see a lot of detail. Here's another picture from the air. This is now looking to the north to orient you. Here's Route 66 again, or where now is I-40, the parking lot, the Red Bull Saloon. The gun shop was over here. I'm sorry, this is the Western Skies Motel. Then there was the gun shop. Again, there's Bill Lasker's general store, bank. This is taking kind of northeasterly. Terrace Canyon's over here. I didn't talk about it, but there were two Hogans that were built here, and they were built by Indian craftsmen, and they were authentic, with the doors facing east, as a Hogan door should. They also had a kiva with a ladder and an entrance in the inside, and I've been told that you could actually go down into this kiva. I don't have any pictures of it, though. Imagine, in today's age of sue-happy customers, to have them crawl down a ladder into a dark space. Now, you see this flatbed truck here? There's a trailer right there, and I'm going to zoom in on that. And this was a sign on wheels that I believe they rolled out to be along Route 66 when the park was open, and then they rolled it back behind the park in the evenings or when it was closed during the non-summer months. And you could go and see that sign today in the morning in the Town Place Antiques at Morningside and Central. Bob Harrington has this sign. He was given to it by a UNM professor who found it, rescued it, and gave it to Bob if he promised never to sell it. So Beavertown is dead, but how sweet it is. A company called Telecake came into town. Now, everybody's heard of Trans World Florists or something. I think they're not in business anymore, but where you could call a local florist and say, I want flowers delivered to my mother in Dearborn, Michigan. And they'd say, we'll get right on that. We'll deliver them this evening. And they didn't deliver them, but they contacted another florist in Dearborn who delivered them. Telecake had the same idea. You're in Albuquerque, you want to deliver a cake to your mother in Dearborn, Michigan. You'd say, you'd give them the specifications. They would contact one of the bakers that was in the Telecake organization, and the cake would be delivered to your mother. So Telecake wanted to have a corporate presence in all 50 states. And their lawyers did some research and found that there was a corporate presence called First American Indian Land, which wasn't operating. So they made an offer to the stockholders of the First American Indian Land in order to purchase the company. And by purchasing it and merging with them, they then had a corporate presence. They didn't have to actually create their own. They just used First American Indian Land. So First American Indian Land merged with Telecake. And that was in 1972. Now Telecake took on. One of the best articles that I read about Little Beaver Town was this one in the New Mexico Historical Review, written by Farrick M. Saz, who was a UNM Regents Professor of History. He's now deceased, but this is a great work. It's heavily documented and is worthy of his PhD standing. Here's one of the Telecake advertisements. This one was in Pittsburgh. But if you were a baker and you wanted to become part of it, you would write to this Los Angeles address. You know, no website, no email address in 72. So Professor Saz makes some guesses. He says Interstate 40 messed it up. There were complaints about the high parking and admission fees. As they had financial problems, the quality of the acts began to decline. And he mentions that in New Mexico, we have an authentic Old West, an authentic Native American culture, and we really didn't need a theme park to kind of recreate something that may have never existed. So the Supreme Court of New Mexico got involved because almost all the contractors who had built Little Beaver Town never got paid. Because I think they built it, you know, they basically built it with a promise that with the revenues of the operations, they would get paid. Well, it failed, never made really any money. And so these guys, Marco Construction, Yucca Plumbing, B&D Electric Company, never got paid. So there was a Supreme Court case because Little Beaver Town didn't exist anymore. First American Indian Land didn't exist anymore. So who existed? Research Park, the owner of the property. So they filed what's called a mechanics lien, saying that you own the property, you owe us for the money that we invested in improving your property. And Research Park was successful in defending itself, saying, we had nothing to do with that construction. That was First American Indian Land. We just leased it to them. So they didn't have to pay and the contractors were stuck. Somebody was going to put me in touch with the person at Marco Construction, but even to this day, all these decades later, he's so ticked off about this, he can't even talk about it. This is a cute story. So Dave Saunders played Red Ryder all these years, and so after Little Beaver Town was gone, he wanted to keep that up. He had a radio show for a short time, and he would go to the state fair and tell Western stories dressed as Red Ryder or cowboy, and part of his costume was a holster and a six-gun. So in 1999, he's coming back from a break, going out to do his performance, and state police officers stop him and say, you can't come here with that gun. And he says, well, it's not loaded. They said, it doesn't make any difference. You can't be on the state fairgrounds with a weapon. And he says, but I'm Red Ryder. And so these guys had no idea who Red Ryder was in 1999. Ultimately, they let him keep his gun as a part of his costume. And here's a picture of Dave Saunders at the age of 74, taken by Todd Ashley in 2006. I think that's a handsome man, 74. Yes?
84.
Oh, he was 84 in 2006?
Yeah, oh no, that's
No, that's not 2006, that was just last year.
Oh, okay. Todd told me that was 2006.
I guess he goes backwards.
I'll have to check on that, but that's Dave. Dave's still here in Albuquerque. He's not doing too well right now. He's in the hospital, and you know, we wish him the best. But I interviewed him on a video half a year ago, and he was not doing very well then. He was pretty healthy, but for all intents and purposes, he couldn't converse with me, so I mostly talked with his wife. So there's been many articles about, Little Beaver Town, mostly in Route 66 magazines, both the New Mexico version and the national version, as well as the New Mexico magazine has done stories, and two of them were written by Alan Carlson. So Fred Harmon, and I'm almost done here, quite an individual. He was one of the original 5 members of what's called the Cowboy Artists in America, and if you like cowboy art, you know what the CAA is. In fact, you have to be invited to be in the CAA, and once you're invited, you can put by your signature the logo CAA, and that means a lot to people who collect Western art, to have artists that are in the CAA. And he was one of the 5 original members, and they wanted to elect him president, and he said, I have too much going on, have somebody else do it. His paintings are on permanent display in the National Cowboy Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City. He's only one of 75 white men adopted into the Navajo Nation. He received the Sertoma Award as Colorado's Outstanding Citizen in 1958. And this is the Red Rider Roundup in Pagosa Springs every July 4th, and the Little Beaver Celebration in Dulce in the middle of July. So his art commands very high prices in the tens of thousands of dollars, if they're even available by private collectors. And there is still an unsold painting in Pagosa Springs if you want to rush up there and bring your checkbook. So these are all the folks who helped me in my research, and I appreciate it very much. And I enjoyed meeting every one of them and talking with them. Doing a project like this is very satisfying. I guess I'm a closeted history buff. When I was a civil engineer, I didn't really care for history. In fact, one of my first college courses at El Camino College in Torrance, California, I took American history and got an F. But that was back in 1967, so I've changed since then. Thank you.